In the 1960s, the Italian Mafia ruled New York. But one night in Harlem, 6 calm words from one man forced them to walk away in silence. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just another tale from Harlem's golden age. It's about respect, power, and the moment when 6 simple words redrew the boundaries of New York City's underworld forever. Picture Harlem in the 1960s. The streets pulse with jazz, the air thick with ambition and danger. This is a world where reputations are built on whispers and destroyed with bullets, and at the center of it all stands Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, better known as Bumpy. Now, if you don't know who Bumpy Johnson was, let me paint you a picture. This wasn't some street corner hustler trying to make a name. Bumpy was Harlem royalty. While the Italian Mafia controlled most of New York, Bumpy controlled something they never could: the heart and soul of Harlem itself. He wasn't the tallest man. He wasn't the loudest. But when Bumpy Johnson walked into a room, everyone knew it. There was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that came from knowing he'd survived things that would have broken lesser men. He'd been shot, stabbed, imprisoned, and betrayed. Each scar was a lesson, and Bumpy was an excellent student. The Italian mob families had a complicated relationship with Bumpy. On paper, they were partners. The Italians ran the bigger operations, and Bumpy managed Harlem for them. But that's not really how it worked, and everyone knew it. Bumpy didn't work for anyone. He worked with people when it suited him, and he maintained his independence through a combination of strategic brilliance and the fierce loyalty of every person in Harlem. The Italian mobsters respected Bumpy's operation, but respect in the criminal underworld is fragile. It needs to be reinforced constantly, defended viciously, and some men, blinded by their own sense of superiority, forgot this fundamental truth. Enter our antagonist, a mid-level mobster from one of the 5 families. For the sake of this story, let's call him Carmine. Now, Carmine was what you might call a made man, which meant he'd been formally inducted into the Mafia. This gave him a sense of invincibility, a swagger that came from knowing he had the full weight of his family behind him. But Carmine had a problem that afflicts many men who rise too quickly without earning wisdom along the way. He confused his family's power with his own intelligence. He thought the organization's reputation would protect him from his own stupidity. The meeting was supposed to be routine. The Italian families and Bumpy's organization would gather to discuss territories, money flows, and the general business of keeping New York's underworld running smoothly. These meetings happened regularly in neutral locations, restaurants, social clubs, places where everyone could feel relatively safe. This particular meeting took place in a restaurant in Little Italy. The irony wasn't lost on Bumpy being summoned to their territory for what was supposed to be a meeting of equals. But Bumpy understood something crucial about power. Sometimes you demonstrate it by not demonstrating it. He arrived on time, dressed impeccably in one of his signature suits, accompanied by a small group of his most trusted associates. The restaurant had been cleared of regular customers, just mobsters, their associates, and the nervous staff who knew better than to pay attention to anything they might overhear. The tables were covered in red checkered cloths, wine flowed freely, and platters of pasta created a deceptively warm atmosphere. The meeting began cordially enough. Business was discussed: numbers, territories, arrangements that kept everyone wealthy and relatively peaceful. Bumpy listened more than he spoke, a habit that had served him well over the years. He knew that powerful men often revealed more than they intended when given enough silence to fill. But as the night wore on and the wine continued flowing, Carmine became emboldened. Maybe he'd been drinking more than the others. Maybe he'd been nursing some perceived slight. Maybe he was just one of those men who couldn't stand that Bumpy commanded such respect without being Italian, without being white, without being part of their exclusive club. Whatever the reason, Carmine decided this was his moment to establish dominance, to put Bumpy in his place. In his alcohol-addled mind, he probably thought he was being clever, asserting the natural order of things as he saw them. The conversation had turned to a dispute over a particular territory. Bumpy had calmly explained his position, laying out the logical reasons why the current arrangement should stand. His argument was sound, his delivery measured. Most of the men at the table were nodding along. They could see he was right, and there was no profit in creating unnecessary conflict. But Carmine couldn't let it go. He interrupted Bumpy mid-sentence, his voice rising above the general conversation. The room grew quieter, sensing the shift in atmosphere the way animals sense an approaching storm. "Listen here," Carmine said, his words slightly slurred but his intention crystal clear, and then he said it, that word. The slur that carried centuries of hatred, degradation, and attempted dehumanization. He called Bumpy Johnson the N-word, right there in front of everyone. The room didn't just go quiet, it went dead silent. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Wine glasses paused at lips. Even the staff in the kitchen seemed to sense that something catastrophic had just occurred. Bumpy's associates tensed, hands moving toward weapons. They'd die for Bumpy happily, and everyone in that room knew it. The other mobsters froze, caught between shock at Carmine's breach of protocol and uncertainty about what would happen next. Because here's what you have to understand. Even in the criminal underworld, even in the 1960s when racism was woven into the fabric of American society, there were lines you didn't cross. Not because of morality necessarily, but because of pragmatism. Bumpy Johnson wasn't someone you disrespected casually. He controlled too much, knew too much, and commanded too much loyalty. Carmine had just stepped over that line wearing concrete shoes, but Bumpy didn't move. Not immediately. He sat there for a moment, his face unreadable. Years of controlling his reactions in life-or-death situations had taught him the power of the pause. He let the silence stretch, let every man in that room feel the weight of what had just happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, Bumpy Johnson stood up. His movements were unhurried, almost casual. He adjusted his suit jacket, that impeccable suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. He looked directly at Carmine, and his eyes, those eyes that had seen men die, that had stared down corrupt cops and rival gangsters, held nothing but cold calculation. The room held its breath. Violence seemed inevitable. Blood would spill on those red-checkered tablecloths, and a war would begin that would make the streets of New York run red. But Bumpy Johnson hadn't become the most powerful black gangster in America by being predictable. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear enough for every man in that room to hear, and he spoke 6 words. Just 6 words that would become legend in the streets of Harlem and echo through the corridors of mob power for years to come. What happened next changed everything. The balance of power, the relationships between families, the very understanding of who held real control in New York City, all of it shifted in that moment. But to understand the true impact of those 6 words, you need to know what they were and why they carried such devastating power. Bumpy looked directly at Carmine, and with the calm of a man who held all the cards, he said, "I got an army in Harlem." 6 words. That's all it took. Now, on the surface, this might not sound terrifying. You might be thinking, okay, so what? The Italian families had armies too. They had soldiers, enforcers, and hitmen. What made Bumpy's army so special? But everyone in that room understood immediately what those words actually meant. This wasn't a threat about firepower or manpower, though Bumpy had plenty of both. This was a statement about something far more dangerous, about loyalty that couldn't be bought, about a community that would burn the city down for him, about a kind of power that no amount of Italian mob muscle could match. See, the Mafia's power was organizational. It was hierarchical. Soldiers followed orders because of tradition, because of fear, because of the structure. But Bumpy's army was different. Every hustler, every numbers runner, every street kid in Harlem saw Bumpy as more than a boss. He was a protector. He kept the Italian mob from completely taking over their neighborhood. He provided jobs when legitimate work was denied to black people. He paid for funerals, helped families in need, and made sure the police didn't brutalize people without consequences. When Bumpy said he had an army in Harlem, What he really meant was, if you come for me, you're not just coming for one man. You're declaring war on an entire community. Every window in Harlem becomes a sniper's nest. Every corner becomes an ambush point. Every person becomes a potential threat. The Italian families would be fighting a guerrilla war in territory they didn't understand, against people who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The old-timers at the table, the bosses who had survived decades in the mob by being smart rather than just tough, they got it immediately. You could see it in their faces. Carmine had just created a problem that couldn't be solved with the usual methods. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He straightened up, adjusted his cufflinks, and prepared to leave. His associates stood with him, their movements synchronized, professional. They weren't rushing, running would show weakness. They simply moved like men who had made their point and had no more business there. The bosses let them go. No one stopped them. No one even spoke. Carmine sat there, suddenly sober, realizing that his moment of racist bravado had potentially just started a war that would cost everyone millions and leave bodies stacked in the streets. After Bumpy and his crew left, the restaurant erupted. The bosses turned on Carmine with fury. What the hell was he thinking? Did he want to destroy years of profitable peace? Did he understand what it would cost to go to war with Harlem? They had other territories, other operations that would suffer if they had to commit resources to fighting Bumpy Johnson on his home turf. Word spread fast. By the next morning, everyone in the underworld knew what had happened. The story got embellished and retold, as these stories do. But the core remained the same. A mobster disrespected Bumpy Johnson, and Bumpy responded with such quiet power that he walked out untouched. While the Mafia scrambled to contain the damage, Carmine's own family had to make a choice. They could back him, support his disrespect, and go to war, or they could cut their losses. In the end, pragmatism won. Carmine was called in for a meeting with his bosses. What happened to him after that depends on which version of the story you hear. Some say he was demoted, stripped of his status. Others say he disappeared entirely. Either way, he was never a problem again. But more importantly, the incident reinforced something crucial. Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. Not because he was the strongest or the most violent, but because he understood power in a way that transcended simple force. He had built something real in Harlem, something that couldn't be conquered or controlled through traditional mob tactics. The Italian families recalibrated their relationship with Bumpy after that. The pretense that he worked for them evaporated. From then on, they dealt with him as an equal, sometimes even deferring to his judgment on matters involving Harlem. They had learned an expensive lesson, without even having to pay for it in blood. Bumpy Johnson continued running Harlem for years after that incident. He became a legend, a symbol of black power and self-determination in an era when such things were rare and dangerous. When he finally died in 1968, thousands attended his funeral. The streets of Harlem were lined with people mourning not just a gangster, but a protector, a provider, a man who had stood up to forces that wanted to crush his community. Those 6 words, "I got an army in Harlem," became part of street legend. They represented something bigger than one confrontation in one restaurant. They represented the idea that respect isn't given based on race or organizational affiliation. It's earned through action, through loyalty, through understanding the real sources of power in this world. The story reminds us that true power doesn't come from titles or intimidation. It comes from the relationships you build, the loyalty you inspire, and the courage to stand firm when others try to diminish you. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than almost anyone, and in that moment when he could have started a war, he instead spoke 6 simple words that prevented one. That's not just gangster wisdom. That's the kind of strategic brilliance that changes history.